Californians can carry guns again after a new ruling in the case against the state's latest gun-free zones. Plus, former board member Rocky Marshall on his testimony this week in the NRA's corruption trial. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with the latest in Guns in America news. Of course, if you like the reporting that we do, you can buy a membership and support it even more, and as well as get access to hundreds of pieces of exclusive news and analysis you will not find anywhere else. This week on the show, we are talking about the National Rifle Association because there's been a lot of big news. I mentioned some of it on the news update last week, but one, Wayne LaPierre, the longtime head of the National Rifle Association, announced his resignation last week. And two, the trial for corruption allegations that stem in large part from his operation of the NRA began this week. And so we actually have somebody who was a witness in the trial and somebody who has experience overseeing the NRA and how it runs. A former board member, Rocky Marshall, who's actually also now running again for the NRA board, on the show with us this week. Welcome to the show, Rocky.
Thank you, Steve. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you back. We had you on a little while ago to discuss a lot of these same issues, and actually that podcast interview has now become part of the record in this NRA case. It was submitted as an exhibit, actually by the NRA itself, or the NRA's lawyers in the case. So welcome back. Maybe we'll make some more news this time.
Okay. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. And I understand that, the podcast did make it into the evidence list. So it's interesting.
Yeah, we'll get into why that is in a little bit. But let's start at the beginning here with your testimony. You were one of the first, I think you were the first
I was
witness.
the first witness, yes.
Yeah, in this case. So why don't you give us an overview of what happened when you were called to the stand?
Yeah, so I thought it was odd that they chose me as the first witness because I was only on the board for roughly a year, 10 months. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of people that have more history than I do with the board. And I think they chose me, the New York AG's office chose me to be the first witness because I wrote so much. I mean, I wrote so many emails to the board when I was on there. And then I've written a lot of, analysis since I left the board to try to communicate to the members what's going on here. So since there was such a record of me writing, I think they decided that was a good comprehensive record of things that were occurring on the board. So that was the reason I went first, which was okay with me. I'm glad that's over, and I'm done with that part. So it definitely was an interesting process for sure.
Yeah, I bet. We'll just give people a little bit of an overview for anyone who's coming to this late. This whole situation with the NRA. The accusation is that Wayne LaPierre and other executives at the NRA used the nonprofit's money to fund lavish personal expenses, things like private jet trips and luxury vacations and fancy suits, all sorts of stuff of that nature. And to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. I think it was $64 million was the claim by the Attorney General, Letitia James, who is a Democrat that does have a history of, calling the NRA a domestic terrorist organization. So there is that factor to consider as well. But your role in all of this is that you were a board member for a while there, and during your time on the board, you became concerned with these allegations. The more you looked at them, and then became a critic and opponent of LaPierre and his group of associates that control the NRA. Is that right?
That's correct. I mean, when I first got on the board, when I was actually appointed. Because a board member had resigned over the bankruptcy filing. So I was appointed to replace that person. When I got on the board, I sort of believed what the NRA was saying, which was this is just a political attack by the New York AG's office, which makes total sense. I mean,
and there's some truth to that, right?
And there's truth to that. So I said, okay, that's fine. I can help them put together a pretty good defense. As a business guy, I'm really good with analysis. And but when I started digging into the records, it's very obvious that there's a lot of things wrong here in terms of the money that was being spent and how it was being spent. I think the number that I heard is that they've quantified as around $110 million worth of misused funds or inappropriate expenditures, those kinds of things. In Texas, we would call that theft, but in the courtroom, they call it malfeasance and all these other things. But it was, people were using money for the personal benefit, at least $100 million. And that's not everything. They didn't have time to track everything, but it's a lot of money for sure.
Right. Because the allegation is that this went on for decades, right? This wasn't just a short thing.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, as near as I can tell, there was an SEC filing that happened in 1998, which was a complaint to the SEC regarding the NRA and some of its vendors, which included Ackerman McQueen. So the same kind of problems that we talk about today with the NRA also were being discussed in 1998. That's a long time, of misuse of relationships, conflict of interest with vendors and those kinds of things. So it appears that it's been at least 25, 30 years worth of abuse for sure.
Yeah. And so what did they focus on in your testimony? And, what did each side ask you about?
Well, so the New York AG's office, which the lawyers that work at the New York AG's office, I thought were really professional and really good. And I didn't feel like that they had an axe to grind or they had a political agenda, unlike the Letitia James, who's the New York AG, who obviously is very political. These people work in the charities arm of the office. They're just doing their job. And their job is to oversee charities in New York. And so I think that's what they're doing, regardless of the political influence around that. And so they focused on the timeline of when I was on the board. What did I observe? What did I do about that? They were very curious as to how did I respond to that and what did I do, and kind of carried me through that 10 months of time that I was there and all the actions that I took. And so I thought they were a very, very logical, very organized, and very pointed discussion of my time on the board. The other lawyers in the case, keep in mind, there's 4 sets of lawyers here. NRA has lawyers, Wayne LaPierre has lawyers, Woody Phillips has lawyers, and John Frazier has lawyers.
Yeah. And Woody Phillips was the former treasurer, and John Frazier is the current counsel,
general counsel secretary. Right. So there's 4 sets of attorneys in the trial, and they all get to ask questions. So the New York AG's office would ask me questions, and then each of those attorneys would also ask me questions. Do you mean to discuss what the other attorneys talked about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, what was now, in theory here, the NRA is really the NRA members are the victims in this case. That's
Correct.
The argument from the Attorney General's office, right, that people like Wayne and Phillips and Frazier defrauded effectively the NRA members by diverting these funds to themselves, or allowing it to happen under their watch, depending on the person involved, right? And there's already been a settlement in this case by Wayne's former chief of staff, Josh Powell, who agreed to, 1, never work on a nonprofit board ever, or work as an officer of a nonprofit in New York ever again, and then 2, to actually pay the NRA back $100,000. So in theory, and that's those are some of the requests for LaPierre and Phillips and the lawyer Frazier as well. But in theory, that puts them on opposite sides of the NRA and its lawyers. Right. But in practice, how did that play out in court? So
it's very obvious that the New York AG's office is pursuing the defendants, which are Wayne LaPierre, Woody Phillips, and John Frazier. They're pursuing them for restitution to the NRA. So if they get restitution, if the court awards restitution, that money goes to the NRA, does not go to the New York AG's office in any form. So the NRA is also a victim as it represents the members. So There does seem to be a separation here. The NRA, unlike in the bankruptcy trial where the separation was not as noticeable, it does seem like there's more separation between the NRA and Wayne LaPierre and the management team. I mean, there's much more criticism is coming from the NRA lawyers than occurred before. And so there seems the NRA is starting to represent itself, which is what it should have been doing all along. But now it seems like they're starting to push back against the management team in the trial.
Did you see that in how they approached your questioning you?
A little bit, because the NRA lawyers were trying to ask me questions in order to bolster what the NRA is about and also what they've done, as opposed to the other lawyers really were trying to attack me personally. They were trying to discredit me. The NRA lawyers didn't try to discredit me. They were really trying to get me to support and make positive comments about the NRA and what they had done in order to, supposedly clean up their organization. So it's a little bit different approach on how they questioned me, for sure.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, because one of the things that is a common criticism from reformers, and I believe you've even made this in the past, is that the lawyers who represent the NRA right now are from a firm called Brewer Attorneys and Counselors, and that's run by a man named Bill Brewer, who has been very cozy with Wayne LaPierre, I guess would be one way of putting it. That he's had quite a lot of his money sent his way by the NRA while Wayne LaPierre was in charge of it. Right. And so there's question by critics of Wayne LaPierre, at least, that also tend to be critics of Bill Brewer. How do you view that, and do you think it's changing?
It seems to be changing to me. I mean, the Brewer law firm, they've billed the NRA at least $100 million in legal fees. And so I'm highly critical of that law firm, as you know, and I even tried to have the Brewer law firm brought in as an agenda item at one of the board meetings when I was on the board, and I couldn't get that done. But it seemed to me the Brewer law firm was more interested in just billable hours throughout this whole process, and supporting Wayne and trying to keep him, intact as the CEO of the NRA. But now it does seem some separation. There was a comment in the news today that Bill Brewer made regarding the recent released audio tape of some of the talks that occurred. And Brewer kind of threw Wayne under the bus there a little bit in his comments. So it seems to me that there is some separation since Wayne has resigned last Friday, I guess, that there's a little bit of separation there. And Wayne's the fall guy is what it kind of looks like.
That's interesting because, just from my watching it from the outside, I haven't seen a lot of difference between how they treated Wayne during the bankruptcy and how they're treating him now in court. There, certainly that there's that comment that you alluded to, which attacked the people who were on that tape. Although Wayne wasn't actually on that tape. They talked about him, but it was Woody Phillips and Tyler Schlop and some of these other, and then executives at Ackerman McQueen basically explaining on tape how the whole scheme worked, which was that they would give Ackerman McQueen, which was just the former media firm that the NRA worked with for a long time, is sort of at the center of this whole scheme. But that they would give company cards from Ackerman McQueen to NRA executives and have them spend on the luxury items, the things that they did not want to become public necessarily, and then Ackerman would just bill that back without detailing what it was for. And they laid this all out in audio form. Mike Spees was the one who reported that over at the Trace. We had him on the show a little while back for actually a totally different topic than the NRA, but it's pretty remarkable audio if you listen to it, because it just kind of lays out everything. But as far as Wayne and the NRA goes in court, you did have them saying this. It seems like their defense, and I want to get your perspective on this because maybe you disagree with how I'm viewing this. Their defense in the bankruptcy, and it feels like they're repeating the same thing now, at least in the early days of this trial, was that, yes, Wayne LaPierre and indeed the NRA leadership over this period of time that's in dispute made mistakes. And some people made more mistakes than others. Like they'll blame Woody Phillips, who got fired, and they'll blame Josh Powell and Chris Cox and some of these other people who lost the internal fight basically at the NRA. And they will blame Wayne a little bit, but then they'll say that, in fact, I believe they claim that some of these other allegations that were brought by the Attorney General against Wayne were completely false. I think they said at one point during the arguments on Tuesday, I believe. And so, they're willing to admit to a certain level of misconduct that occurred, but their argument is that misconduct was dealt with and corrected. And so, like, yes, Wayne made mistakes by taking excess benefits, is what they call it.
Right.
But he paid back the excess benefits that he admitted taking to. Now, they only admit that he took a tiny fraction of what he's accused of taking. Right. And it just feels like to me so far that I've seen that same argument play out again from the bankruptcy trial, where it didn't work. Although that was the bankruptcy trial didn't work because they weren't bankrupt, is sort of at the end of the day.
Right.
But it seems like the same basic legal argument is playing out now. Am I getting that wrong? I mean, you were in the court, obviously, for your testimony. You weren't able to watch the rest of the proceedings, but you've obviously been following it all.
Well, yeah. So that you captured that pretty well. So they're basically saying is, there were some problems, but we fixed all that. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not true. I mean, that's not true at all. I mean, the excess benefits, they're still finding those. I mean, even this year, 2023, on their upcoming tax return, they're going to report $300,000 of excess benefits to Wayne for years from like 2014 through 2019. They're still uncovering this. The total excess benefits that Wayne has supposedly paid back is $990,000. Well, the claim is millions of dollars. So there's a huge gap between what supposedly he paid back and what the embezzlement was, or the misuse of funds, however you want to describe that, the theft was. But the reality is, even paying back the funds, the fact that they took them to begin with, it's still theft. I mean, they misused the money, they stole the money for their personal benefit, and paying it back doesn't make that right. You don't get to clean the slate. Once you've robbed the bank, you're still a bank robber, no matter what happens after that. So, but yeah, that's the image they're trying to present is, we had some problems, we fixed it, and everything's okay now. But everything's still not okay, for sure.
Yeah, so it seems like you get the general feeling of that's their legal argument, but you do feel like they've perhaps are now more willing to go a little bit harder against Wayne than they were during the bankruptcy, for instance.
It seems to me that there is. I mean, okay. And mostly what I say that I didn't see that in the courtroom as much. I saw it in what the lawyers said in the press and what their comments were, and it just seemed. I mean, I haven't really seen a lot of separation, but now there seems like there's more. The NRA seems to be trying to stand on the ground as, Wayne's gone, he resigned, he's out, and we don't have that problem anymore. And so, I wish they'd have done that earlier. Like 4 or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but they didn't. So here we are. But we'll see how the trial progresses.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that was part of obviously Wayne in his announcement said that there were health reasons for him leaving. Now his announcement came literally the business day before the trial began, but
right.
Do you question that timing? Now they've also said, I guess, they have since revealed what the health concerns was, and apparently it's chronic Lyme disease. Was the claim, according to the NRA's lawyers. And they also, the story we just wrote, they also have claimed that Wayne will not receive any sort of financial benefit from the NRA after he's resigned at the end of the month. That's another thing, too. His resignation doesn't actually go into effect until the end of the month. So it's,
right.
This is another sort of, one of the big problems with their legal argument has always been, well, Wayne's at the center of all this stuff. And you're saying you've reformed and fixed things, but the guy who's at the core of it is still running everything. And that's still kind of true. because he's still not gone yet.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no,
but as far as those two claims of that he won't receive any sort of financial benefit from the NRA, no contracting consulting agreement or payment for his likeness or something like, because that had been part of the bankruptcy trial, was that there was this big contract that he was proposed for him to get a lot of money after he left. And that was one of the big controversial things about Woody Phillips, is after he was forced out, they signed him on to be this contractor. So he's still getting money from the NRA.
Right.
And so they're claiming that's not going to happen with Wayne. They're pretty definitive about it too in the letter. And then they also said that it really is just a health concern. What do you make of all this?
Well, yeah. Okay. To resign on a Friday before the trial begins on Monday, it looks really suspicious. And you really didn't resign. You were correct. I mean, he's still employed. The resignation is not effective until like January 24th or sometime at the end of the month. 31st. So he's still employed there. If you were going to make the argument that we really have cleaned house, I mean, when I was on the board back in 2021, I called for Wayne's resignation while I was there. I wrote an email to the board saying, based on all the evidence, Wayne needs to be removed, because then you can really tell the court, we cleaned house. We found fault with management. Management took monies, and we terminated their employment. And that would be a good, strong case in the bankruptcy trial or in the trial with the New York AG. We have fixed these problems. But when the management is still in place, you have no argument. There is no argument that you can say that we've still cleaned house, and yet the management, one of the managers is still there, the CEO of all people. So that argument is pretty hollow. There's nothing to that.
And do you think that has changed now with the resignation, or do you think the fact that he's still in place through most of this trial undercuts it? Or
I think it doesn't. At this point, it doesn't matter. I mean, if like I said, if they had done this years ago, they might be in a better position to make that argument. I mean, this all has just happened on Friday. It's not. You can't use the argument. There's too much data here to suggest that Wayne was still running it and still have a conflict of interest during all this period of time when they said, "Oh, we've cleaned up everything." No, you haven't. I mean, you really haven't. So that's not going to fly in court, I don't think.
And what do you make of some of the maneuvering that's been going on internally that seems perhaps connected to Wayne's resignation? For instance, Charles Cotton, who's the current president of the NRA, his term as president was supposed to be up last year, and Willis Lee was supposed to move into that role. He was removed from his officer position and has since been very critical of what's going on at the NRA, including the legal strategy and Bill Brewer. And then Charles Cotton was the board amended the bylaws of the organization to allow him to serve for another term. And then in addition to that, Andrew Arula-Nundum, who was the longtime spokesperson and close confidant of Wayne LaPierre, was moved last month from spokesperson to head of general operations. They fired the old head to do this. And of course, the person who succeeds the executive vice president, in other words, Wayne LaPierre, if he should retire, is the head of general operations. So, obviously there was some internal maneuvering that went along with this whole resignation where, then Charles Cotton has obviously also been very supportive of Wayne. I believe he was the chairman of the committee that approved a lot of the expenses after the fact.
The audit committee.
The audit committee, right. So he's a longtime Wayne ally as well. What do you make of all that?
Well, okay, so this is pretty classic. From my experience of being on the board, the bylaws, they don't follow the bylaws. I mean, that's the whole point of having them. It gives you a guideline that the board can use to have good governance of the board. They never did. I mean, I would bring up objections all the time in board meetings about things that they were doing that was totally in violation of the bylaws. They didn't care. They really didn't care. I mean, they would just get up and say, well, there's a lot of things in the bylaws. I mean, those are just suggestions, and then to manipulate them to keep Charles Cotton in place. Again, that's just another abuse of the bylaws. I mean, one of the things in the bylaws is the board is totally responsible for any change in the charter of the organization. For example, like if you were going to file bankruptcy, the board is responsible for that. They delegated that to the special litigation committee. They delegated their authority away. You can't do that. You can't delegate a core authority away, that because then you lose the oversight. So the bylaws they don't follow. They didn't follow them while I was there. They obviously still not follow them because they manipulate them in whatever form they want. So, which also makes it look bad in the trial because you're not, you have to follow the bylaws. They don't. And that's just more evidence that the New York AG's office will use in the trial. So it's unfortunate that they still do this.
Yeah. Well, so let's get to some of those. You said that the other lawyers for people like Wayne and Woody Phillips were questioning you as far as your credibility goes. And this kind of dovetails with why the last podcast was apparently submitted as evidence. It appears to be connected to another filing from the NRA's lawyers from the Brewer firm, as far as I understand it, that deals with so-called whistleblowers, right? There's a whistleblower report, and they have the NRA has kind of listed the people that are being brought up as whistleblowers, you among them, and then they have responses to each one as to why they were not either weren't retaliated against, or what happened with them wasn't inappropriate. And so their response for you is that one of the things that happened after you became a vocal critic on the board is that you were not renominated by the board's nominating committee for another term, right?
Right.
And
that's correct.
And so that was used as an example of why of retaliation against you. And they used our previous podcast interview with you, where to claim that they didn't dispute that happened, that you weren't renominated, but they said essentially that you could have run by petition and didn't try to do that, and that therefore, what happened with you was not a example of retaliation or inappropriate conduct.
Right. Yeah. So the tradition at the NRA was, once you've served on the board, it's automatically you're given the opportunity to be renominated. It's a courtesy. It's just a courtesy. It's not really written anywhere, but it's a courtesy that they extend to current board members, is to be included on the ballot. They didn't give me that courtesy, and I even had there were some board members that spoke to the nominating committee about that on my behalf, because that's the normal process. But that wasn't given in my case, because I'd been a very harsh critic. And so they didn't want me back to come on the board because my criticisms are going to continue. But they retaliated in lots of ways. I mean, one way, I never got a committee assignment. I requested to be on the finance committee, the audit committee, the bylaws committee. I didn't get any committee assignments. Everyone else got committee assignments, and I didn't get any because they didn't. And the committees is where you can really make an impact and you can really help put together information that's presented to the entire board. I wasn't on any committee because they didn't want me on a committee. And that's what was pretty common with other board members. If they spoke out, their committee assignments were pulled and they were thrown off of committees, because that way it keeps them quiet. And that's the way they work. They just want to silence you, keep you quiet, and not give you an opportunity to speak. And that's just one of the ways they do that.
Okay. And so in other words, this was not the only form of retaliation in your mind, and also that it was done. The process of not renominating you was intentionally because of your criticism.
Correct. That's correct.
And so from here, where do you see this case going? What is your view of how things are likely to turn out?
Well, okay, so this is a 6-week trial. I think on the New York AG's witness list, I think there's 35 witnesses. And I think there's roughly that many on all the other attorneys' lists. I think there's roughly 60 to 65 witnesses. I'll be surprised if they're able to get through all of those, because that's a lot of people in to do in 6 weeks. So, I mean, my testimony was an hour and a half, so you can only do so many people every day. I don't know that there's room to do all that, but I think everybody that's that has witnessed some of the things that went wrong at the NRA, they're going to have the same story. It may be a different story about their time on the NRA board. I mean, Oliver North's going to have a story. Josh Powell is testifying. He's going to have a story. Judge Journey's testifying. He's going to have a story. They're all going to be, but the theme of all those stories is going to be the same. The management at the NRA did a lot of things wrong. They embezzled monies. They did wire fraud. They spent, NRA monies, NRA members' donations on personal things, flying family members around the world. So this is not going to end well for the NRA. The NRA there is no valid defense. I mean, you can't claim that, all of these expenses or most of these expenses were really business related. They weren't. They obviously weren't. They've already admitted to the fact that they weren't. So you can't make that claim. And so the jury's going to see that. This is a jury trial. And I was testifying right in front of the jury. They're going to see the facts here. And it really stacks up hard against the NRA. I can't say any way that they can prevail here. I mean, it seems to me that this trial is going to go one direction and it's not going to go well for the NRA. So at the end of this, we'll see what the judge decides what he wants to do. But I think the defendants are not going to fare well in the trial.
What do you think the ultimate impact will be on the NRA? I mean, obviously they could bar, Wayne and Phillips and Frazier from working for the NRA or other nonprofits. They can order them to pay restitution, potentially into the millions, I suppose, to the NRA itself. Right. But what else could happen?
It appears to me that there's several things that can happen. One is I suspect. Let's assume that the defendants lose the case, which it looks like I can't imagine it going any other way. They will be removed, because if you're found guilty of embezzling funds, you're going to be removed by the court. So I think that's a likely outcome. Restitution is also a likely outcome. If they lose the case, I would suspect the New York AG's office is going to ask for restitution. Again, those monies go back to the NRA. They don't go to the New York AG's office. The next thing the court could do is appoint a monitor to come in and actually oversee the NRA and also identify any other problems that might exist. So that's also an option that could occur. And we'll see what the judge says. If the judge doesn't appoint a monitor and all he does is remove the defendants and maybe has some restitution and all the other things remain in place, then I think the NRA hasn't changed a whole lot, other than, Wayne will be gone, John Frazier will be gone, but everybody else is still there. So that will, I think the NRA is going to really struggle if there's not a fundamental change in the organization. I think a monitor would do that. So we'll see how that turns out.
Okay. Look, there's another aspect of all this I'm hoping you can address a little bit, because one of the things that I've noticed reporting on this is, especially in the gun rights movement or the gun rights side of things, a lot of people have been pretty resigned to what's going on with the NRA. They don't, there's a common belief that it just doesn't really matter that the NRA, that this is all happening to it, that, there's other groups out there that are growing or that people like a lot, that have accomplishments, and they'll just take up the slack for what the NRA loses. Now it seems that you don't necessarily agree with this point of view, because for one, you are running for the NRA board. You got on the ballot through petition. You didn't do that right after the first time you were taken off the ballot, but you are now. And that implies to me that you think there's still good reason to go and try and change the course of the organization.
Right. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to give up on the NRA, because the NRA for 150 years has been a solid organization. It's just unfortunate that the management team got caught up in this corruption, because it really taints the mission of the NRA. But there is no group like the NRA. I mean, as much as I like the other groups and I know what they're doing, they don't have this scope. They don't have this size. They don't have the means to do the work that the NRA does. So I still think there's a glimmer of hope that if the trial goes a certain way, maybe, just maybe, we can turn it around and get it back on track. And that's one of the reasons I decided to try to get back on the ballot, because maybe we can fix it. And there's others. I mean, Judge Journey's on the ballot this year. Dennis Fusaro's on the ballot this year. And a guy that a lot of people know, Jeff Knox, is also on the ballot this year. And again, we kind of all talked and said, listen, let's try to get on the board. If we can't, after the trial, maybe there's an opportunity we can still save this organization. It may be too late. I mean, we'll see, but it's just hard to give up, on something this important. All of us want to just keep fighting and try to get it back to the members' hands and doing the work and following the mission that it should. And we'll see if that works out. The other gun rights groups are doing great, and I want to encourage them and support them. But if we lose the NRA, we've lost a lot in our world of gun rights, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think even now, after having lost like a half of its revenue and more than 1 million members, it's still larger than all the other gun rights groups combined.
Correct.
At this
That's
point.
correct.
And
Right.
as you mentioned, it also does a lot of the more successful gun rights groups right now, which have grown as well in the time that the NRA has declined. I don't think that their growth has matched the decline of the NRA. Was
Right.
another important thing for people to consider. But also, they're mainly successful in legal fights, which is a valid, obviously, pursuit and very impactful in a lot of cases. But the NRA does that. Plus, I mean, the NRA did Bruin, right? That was an NRA-backed case.
Right.
But they also do all sorts of other things that you don't see as much activity from other groups on. Things like, gun safety training for one. They're the
Right.
still by far the largest gun safety training organization in the country, probably the world, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And then, there's also the lobbying side of things, both the federal and state level, grassroots activation, political spending on ads and things like that. There's just so much that the NRA does that has had to cut back on a lot of that stuff as well because of all this. But even still, remains much larger than everyone else. Of course, most of their resources right now are going to this sort of thing, fighting this case, and
Right.
So I think that's something a lot of people don't quite fully grasp is the importance of all this as far as the gun rights movement is concerned.
Well, plus, I think if we can get rid of the element of the NRA that has brought it to this point and get a clean slate of management members and all those things, I think the members will come back. I mean, there's so many comments I've read on things like your articles where people said, not another dime until Wayne's gone, and those kind of things. And so I think if we can clean it up, I think the members will recognize they've got a good organization and they'll be wanting to donate again. Yeah, I want to donate. I mean, I haven't donated since I've been on the board because they're going to spend the money in a way that doesn't support our mission. So, but later on, hopefully we can get new management and new board. If the board needs to be addressed, because there's board members that are on there that should not be on there, then I think we can save it. But this is a long road. This is a hard road for us to be on, for sure.
All right. Well, we'll have to have you back on perhaps again once the trial is wrapped up, or maybe further developments down the line here, because I think your point of view is important to this discussion. I've also, of course, invited the NRA's leadership to come on the show. Wayne or LaPierre, Andrew Rulanundum, Charles Cotton. I've reached out to the NRA and basically gave them an open invitation anytime they would like to come on and discuss these issues. They are welcome. We post these episodes unedited, so I'm happy to talk with them and get their side of the story as well, if they choose to do that. But yeah, we really appreciate you coming on and giving us your point of view on this. If people want to follow what you're doing or you're want to follow your campaign to get back on the board, how can they do that?
Okay, so what would be a huge help? So the ballot for this next board will come out in the March edition of the American Rifleman. So if you're an NRA member and you're eligible to vote, you should receive a ballot in your magazine. if you would be willing to vote for myself, Rocky Marshall, Judge Phil Journey, Jeff Knox, and Dennis Fusaro, the four of us are working together to try to bring good governance back to the NRA. That's our only goal, is to try to save this organization. So if you will help us do that and tell your friends, tell 10 of your friends to please vote for us. We need your votes in order to try to make a difference here. So that would be a huge help. You can, if you want to follow some of the things that I'm doing, you can, I do press releases from time to time and talk about various things, and you can Google my name, NRA and my name, and you'll see some things that I'm writing. But the main thing you can do right now is please vote and help us get on the board, and I think we can fix it. So that's what we're trying to do.
All right. Appreciate it. We're going to head on over to our news update now.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. How are we doing this week, Steve?
I'm doing pretty good. Glad to have you back from vacation. I know you had some difficulty getting back, and it was actually, wasn't it related to that plane that fell apart in midair?
That is right. Yeah, my the planned flight that I was supposed to take coming back from Florida was one of those Boeing MAX 9s, and the FAA grounded those right as I was actually on the plane. We were all seated and we had to deplane, and so it ended up being like a 24-hour ordeal trying to find replacement flights, and multiple connecting flights later I'm finally back here in Denver and back on the podcast.
Oh my gosh. Well, that's going to make a really good episode of Air Disasters. My favorite show is Air Disasters. And one of the problems with that being your favorite show is that anytime there's some sort of plane crash, one of my first thoughts is this is going to make a good episode. Air disaster. So it's nice when there's a disaster and nobody gets hurt, because then it's like,
right,
this is going to be really interesting, but also not sad like many of the other episodes.
Sure.
So, but yeah, glad to have you back. What do we got in terms of the news this week?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the first links we've got in the newsletter comes to us from the Washington Post, and it's just about Maryland's governor announcing that he plans to push for a state level Office of Gun Violence Prevention, taking a direct cue from the White House. They started the first White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention and urged other states to do the same. So at least one state so far since that happened is taking that lead to push for it, at least.
Yeah. Potentially something you'll see as a trend in the deeper blue states, I'd imagine, moving forward. I mean, a couple other ones already have this, right? I think the governor said it was the first one, but it's not, right?
Yeah, I was pretty confused by the governor's comments, and a lot of reporting on this has claimed it's the first ever, but Colorado's had one since 2021. I think even before Colorado, New York and California had one. There's not that many out there, granted, but there certainly are other states that have state level offices of gun violence prevention. So
yeah, that's where the White House got the idea from, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, I think that's right. What are you going to do?
Oh, well, whatever. I also don't really know what these things do outside of like hold meetings, I guess.
Yeah. But they collect data here in Colorado, like, crime data and stuff. So it's almost like a replacement for your state level crime data. But yeah,
a rebranding thing, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a coordination thing. I guess the idea is they coordinate, which could be useful, could be nothing. I don't know. Depends on the people involved, I guess.
Certainly. And then, one of the other links we're going to talk about comes to us from Bearing Arms, talking about just the new Democratic majority in the Virginia state legislature. They have both chambers now, and they are using their new majorities in both chambers to really push for, throwing the kitchen sink at the gun control issue. Everything from assault weapon bans to new waiting period laws appear to be on the table. So definitely big news. It's sort of almost seems like a repeat of 2020 or 2019 when was the big push, at least in terms of the enthusiasm that seems to be behind the issue among the Democratic majority.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, we'll see where these things go, because the Democrats have control, but they have like the thinnest majorities you could have, one vote majority, and I think in the Senate. So, yeah, and of course the governor is still Glenn Youngkin, who's a Republican, and very likely to veto any of these bills that get through. I would guess. We'll have to see. I mean, he hasn't had to deal with that to this point, vetoing controversial gun bills. But I also, you wonder under the dynamics of the majorities here, whether because I'm in Virginia, obviously, whether they're going to actually get through some of these things. Lobby day for the local gun rights group, VCDL, Virginia Citizens Defense League, is coming up on Monday, I think, when this goes public. Obviously our members will get this on Sunday, but the episode goes public on Monday, which I believe is the day that VCDL is headed to Lobby Day. People probably remember that, even if you're not in Virginia, from 2020, right before the pandemic, actually. That's when the big fight you're alluding to over the previous gun bills happened. It probably helped kill the assault weapons ban here in Virginia, although a number of other policies did get through, like red flag laws and local gun-free zone autonomy, things like that, a universal background check. There's some of the lower hanging fruit things of gun control policy have already been done in Virginia, so that you're getting, if this legislature wants to pass anything, it's going to end up being one of the much more controversial bills that more severely restrict gun ownership or gun carry. And so it'll be really interesting to see where that ends up, but we'll keep an eye on it for sure.
Yeah, it'll certainly be a story to follow. Then the last link we're going to talk about comes to us from the Associated Press, reporting on some statements that the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, made about the efficacy of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and particularly the expanded, quote unquote, background checks for 18 to 20-year-olds, where they look into juvenile records. And Merrick Garland claims that specific provision has stopped more than 500 gun sales from going through that otherwise would have gone through under just the normal NICS system. So an interesting claim.
Yeah. And he did make that very specific claim that it wasn't just that they stopped 500 sales to prohibited persons during, since the law's been put in place. He specifically said it was because of this new enhanced background check system, which is if people recall from when this was passed, it was a bit controversial because it's basically a de facto waiting period for anyone 18 to 20 years old, because it gives the FBI 3 days just to initiate this sort of intensive check of policy they reach out to the law enforcement agencies and wherever this check is happening, and they look for records that aren't generally submitted to NICS. And he's claiming that process has specifically has blocked these 500 sales. Now there were a couple examples, right?
That's right. Yeah. So some of the examples are interesting, and you can see where it came in handy, right? They found, juvenile violent crime convictions that would otherwise not be publicly available or not available to NICS. But some of the other ones, like the lead example that he gave, is interesting because he said it stopped a sale to someone who was determined to be an unlawful user of a controlled substance. And it doesn't specify whether that means a conviction or court-ordered treatment or something like that. And so we talked a little bit before we started recording about, that raises some questions potentially about, a juvenile, simple weed possession. Is that enough to block an 18 to 20-year-old from ever being able to, exercise their Second Amendment rights? I don't know. It's a live question now based on this law. Yeah,
well, I think that one of the other examples was an involuntary commitment that they found for juvenile or somebody who was involuntarily committed while they were a juvenile. And then obviously this check is happening as they're between the ages of 18 and 20. But, if you just think about the frequency of involuntary commitments versus drug-related encounters with law enforcement or the justice system, it seems likely that there are many more of the drug-related sort of denials than the involuntary commitment ones. But they don't break that down easily in this release, so we don't know for sure. But interesting nonetheless. I would expect that it would be good to know even more about how these are coming out. Like, what exactly do they mean by addicted to? Like, what is the standard they're using for that? Because that could be any number of things, really, it seems. So hopefully we'll get more information on that in the moving forward here. But yeah, as of now, hearing what the AG said, I would expect that a lot of those 500 are some sort of drug-related juvenile offense that the person was was charged with, or treatment or something like that, rather than involuntary commitments or things of that nature. Although obviously there would be some of those in the mix as well.
Yeah, certainly. But we'll keep on top of that if any more information, detailed information, becomes available. And then heading into some of the stories we wrote this week, we have one based on a letter that a group of attorney general from 20 Democratic-controlled states sent to the White House, specifically the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, rather, that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, the White House version.
Asking them to look into the Lake City Army ammunition plant and launch an investigation, first of all, and two, make sure that future contracts at that plant exclude and prohibit the future possibility of selling excess supply to the civilian market. So it's, once again, gun control advocates are going back towards that plant. This has been a kind of a long-standing target for them, just because it comprises such a large supply of the civilian ammunition supplies, particularly for 5.56 ammo, which obviously listeners may know is what the AR-15 usually fires. So.
Right. Yeah. If you see Winchester branded 5.56, I believe that all comes from this particular plant. And yeah, we've seen efforts before by the Biden administration to, or at least they've considered shutting off that production for civilian use, which is exactly what these AGs are pushing. Now, one of the things I found interesting about this was not who was on the list. There's 20. But as you know, there are more than 20 attorney generals who are attorneys general. By the way, I guess that's the proper way to say it, is attorneys general. I don't know why, but that's the proper grammar. Attorneys general who there's more than 20 Democratic ones out there, but only 20 signed on to this, led by Letitia James, who I spoke about earlier. She's the one who's pursuing the civil case against the NRA and doing all kinds of other high profile litigation with Donald Trump and people like that as well. But, and she went after Cuomo back when he was governor too. So, she's the center of a lot of this kind of stuff. But yeah, there's, I think there were 4 who didn't sign on from, more swing states, basically Pennsylvania, Colorado, or at least not that Colorado is necessarily a swing state anymore, but it's a little bit less aggressive on gun policy as some of the other Democratic states have been. Wisconsin was another one. And I think North Carolina is that?
Yes, North Carolina. That's right.
That's the 4th. So that's interesting to me, just who they were not able to get on board. But also, you have this ongoing debate. First of all, I guess there's a couple points, right? Ammunition that comes out of this plant, not any different from the 5.56 ammunition you could buy from any civilian manufacturer. And Winchester is a civilian manufacturer. They're just using a military plant to make this ammunition. So it's not different from what you could buy anyway. And additionally, it's not just a benefit to civilians, this kind of production. At least that's the point that National Shooting Sports Foundation made when they talked to you about this, right? When you got comment from them. That's right. The gun industry's trade group. What is, it's not just a benefit to civilians, this sort of production. It also helps the military, right?
That's right. Yeah. When I spoke with Mark Oliva over at the NSSF, he told me that actually it was the Department of Defense's idea in the first place to make this excess supply available to civilians, because with a steady stream of production, it keeps them ready to go at a moment's notice if the military ever needs them to ramp up production for, a war or a big defense effort. And plus that excess sales provides more funding to the factory. So once again, they can buy more equipment or hire more people if they need to tool up at a moment's notice. And so it really wouldn't be a good situation for that factory if it was idle most of the time and all of a sudden a war kicked off and they suddenly needed to spike production for our troops and they had to scramble and find a bunch of employees that aren't trained and aren't experienced. So it really is a benefit for both for civilians and for the military.
Yeah, and I guess that's the dispute from these attorneys general, that they think of it as the military subsidizing civilian ammo production, when really it seems to be the other way around to a certain degree. Like this, keeping this production for civilian use going is actually a benefit to the military because it allows them to keep people on staff, to keep renewing facilities as they go between, wars, basically. And so it helps with, it's kind of a win-win sort of situation for
That's right.
civilian gun owners and the military is at least the idea that NSSF is putting forth here. And so, yeah, shutting down production would harm certainly the civilian market because it provides, I think in the story you said 30% of supply, right? For at least a 5.56.
That's right.
223 is obviously another common, almost identical round that's used in ARs. But that would spike prices quite significantly. Like obviously the ammunition wouldn't go away. There's a lot of civilian makers who produce it too, but it would reduce supply, as we've all seen over the last couple of years, makes prices much higher. And sure seems like maybe that's the real point of this. Now, the AGs all say that it's because this ammo has shown up in mass shootings. But I mean, it's just this ammo is the most common, I think, single plant, or this plant makes most of this ammo, at least the single most, not all of it, not 50%, but it makes 30% of the market. So it's going to show up in a lot of different places. It's like a Ford F-150 or a Honda Civic, probably used in a lot of crimes, but not because it's a particularly designed to be useful in criminal activities, but just because they're extremely common.
Yeah, no, that's right. And
that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's just one of those things where it's so ubiquitous that it'll wind up in negative uses and positive uses. It's just
and it winds up in the vast majority of the time in perfectly lawful positive use. But anyway, that's the core of the fight. Is they say sometimes this ammunition made by Lake City shows up at mass shootings, and so the military also there's a whole the whole aspect of they don't think AR-15 should be legal, and so they don't want the ammunition that they use to be legal either because they claim it's military grade and should only be used by the military. And so it is sort of the core of all these debates that you see around these sorts of firearms and ammunition. So keep an eye on that. They didn't go through with it last time, but maybe in a second term, Biden pushes the envelope on this as well. Wouldn't be surprising to see him do that, right? He's been very aggressive at unilaterally trying to restrict firearms in the United States. And this is an area where he probably has even more discretion than normal to do something like that. It's just whether he's willing to sacrifice potentially military readiness to accomplish that goal. And he hasn't been to this point, but perhaps the calculation changes for him with more pressure from his allies in his party or the gun control movement. We will have to see if he does go through it. There'll be a major effect on the civilian ammunition market for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And then one of the last stories that we covered this week has to do with California. Obviously, we covered quite extensively the legal fight over their Brewer response bill to restrict gun carry. It essentially made most of the state off limits to licensed gun carry. Well, that law has officially been blocked once more because a panel of appeals court judges removed the administrative stay that was placed on it and allowed the injunction that was initially issued. Sorry, this gets kind of confusing because of all these courts that are involved. Allowed that initial injunction from the district court level to take effect. So that law is blocked as of this moment.
Yes. So a district court judge, a federal judge, found the law was unconstitutional, blocked enforcement of it. Basically across the board. The plaintiffs won on all their claims. And then there was an administrative stay put in place that sort of undid his entire ruling, which meant that the law could go into effect because the initial injunction happened before this law was set to go into effect. Then the stay happened right before the law was set to go into effect. So it went into effect for about a week. And then now the stay has been completely dissolved. So the old ruling is back into effect, which means that the law cannot go into effect. So
Yeah.
it gets kind of complicated to follow, and there's a lot of whiplash here. But the bottom line is that basically the restrictions that were in place before this law are still there, but the new ones, the vast majority of them are not being enforced at this moment. Now, that could all change depending on how these appeals go. And this one of the sort of difficulties with preliminary injunctions is that if they get reversed on appeal and you did the thing that was illegal under the law and the injunction protecting you gets taken away, they could, in theory, come after you. But I think that's more of a risk with something like a hardware ban than a carry ban, because you're just not it's not likely they're going to come back after people down months and years from now and say, oh, you carried in that park during the injunction, so we're going to go after you for that because the injunction got taken away. But anyway, the bottom line, this was something we talked at length last week with Robert Leiter from George Mason University. It's one of his points that I think is interesting. But in practice right now, the law enforcement officials in California are barred from enforcing these new gun-free zones. So carry is effectively back because the gun-free zones were so broad that they kind of made it impossible to carry in a practical sense. Anyway, that's so a lot of whiplash going on in California, but right now things are back to the status quo of where they had been before this law was passed.
Yep, that's right. And then the last thing we kind of wanted to touch on was actually your members piece. So members can already read this piece that we're talking about, but detailing some of the new recordings that came to light about the NRA and some of the pattern of misconduct that had been alleged for a long time to this point. And now we actually have some recordings of NRA officials talking about the misconduct and how they went about concealing this misconduct. If you want to just describe a little bit for listeners, what that
we
recording.
won't spend a lot of time on this because I think we talked a little bit about it with Rocky, and obviously we talked a lot about just the NRA situation generally with Rocky. But I do have a members piece that just goes over how this new audio that Mike Spies, who we had on the show not too long ago, actually, but about an entirely different topic than the NRA. But he was the one who actually broke the first big story about the corruption there in 2019 and set off this whole internal fight and legal case that's gone on since that time. And now he's dropped this new audio that it's, the thing about this audio is it's not that this scheme wasn't known or like at least alleged before now, or even the very specific details of this particular part of it, right? This Amex, Ackerman McQueen, the old NRA media contractor that the group had towards the end of its relationship, they were spending $40 million a year on Ackerman, and they would do it in a way where there wasn't a lot of accountability or checking. They basically just build what they build, and there was no itemizing of what the NRA was supposed to be paying for. And so that's how a lot of this corruption is alleged to have happened, right? They would have Ackerman give, and in this specific case, they literally had Ackerman give an Ackerman credit card, a Platinum American Express, to the NRA's director of advancement, who was a former Ackerman employee. Tyler Schroep is his name. And he's still there, actually, at the NRA, which is a potential problem for the NRA's legal case, because a lot of the NRA's legal case relies on the idea that they've cleaned up, they've gotten rid of all the people who were causing problems. And this makes it fairly clear that that's not true, because Tyler's still there, even with Wayne gone now, technically, or he will be gone, which is sort of part of that whole argument. They still have people like Tyler, and John Frazier is still there. So some of these people who are at the center of a lot of this stuff. And they kept on people like Woody Phillips, the former treasurer, who was also involved in this audio tape. After he was forced out, he got a contracting job, but the NRA was still paying him money. So, a lot of their legal argument relies on the idea that they've self-corrected and they've gotten rid of the people who are the gory problems. But, this audio and just a number of other things call that into question. But so the idea was Ackerman would give Tyler Schropp, the NRA advancement director, a Platinum American Express card that he could use to hide basically certain expenses that Wayne LaPierre, according to Woody Phillips, the former treasurer, did not want to be public. He didn't want people to know that he was taking private flights around, and that has since become one of the central pieces of this whole corruption scandal, these private flights for Wayne and even just for his family members when he's not even on the plane. So Tyler was meant to take this card, use it for those sorts of expenses so that they'd be billed through Ackerman, and then Ackerman would bill the NRA later on without itemizing why they were getting billed this money. And then he would also, at the same time, he would run his regular expenses through the NRA through normal channels. And so you can kind of see the problem with that, or how this scheme all worked. And that's the thing about this audio tape is like, it's not that this wasn't known or alleged that this is how these things occurred. Even the Amex card has come up. Tyler Schropp has had to answer for it in depositions before. But they're on tape explicitly saying, we want to do this so that Wayne's expenses, these certain kinds of expenses, luxury hotels like the Beverly Hills Hotel and St. Regis and Four Seasons, that they wouldn't show up on NRA records, and they wouldn't have to report them in the 990. So, it's certainly pretty remarkable when you get audio like that comes out and they're just saying, yeah, the way we're going to hide these expenses is through this scheme here. And we're doing this because we don't want this stuff to be public.
Yeah,
but
certainly fairly damning audio, but like, right. Yeah, I was going to say it's not become uncommon exactly to catch people saying incriminating things on audio tape lately. But that is, like you said, that is the age we live in. Apparently.
So anyway, people can go and listen to that audio on, there's Mike published it on ProPublica and the Trace, obviously left-leaning outlets, but I mean, it's audio. You can listen to it for yourself. It's not,
we link to it in the newsletter as well. So
yeah, you don't have to rely on Mike's, whatever you think about Mike Speeds or the Trace, you don't have to rely on that. You can just listen to the audio itself. So I recommend people do that, but that's just, again, it perfectly encapsulates how this scheme worked and why it was so problematic and why it was so easy under a system like that to charge NRA members for things that they shouldn't have had to pay for, right? Like, I mean, that's just the bottom line. But that's all we got for the news this week. I heard you went to like a farm show. What is it?
Yeah, so listeners who maybe live out west or have traveled to Denver may be aware of the National Western Stock Show. It's a big Denver tradition every year in January. I think it's still the largest ag and rodeo show in the U.S. at least. It might be even in North America. But it's basically a 2-week period where there's this huge giant complex just outside of downtown where they all sorts of things. There's ag expos and there's livestock.
They do like a parade of the cows too.
Yeah, every year. That's the most famous thing people probably know is to kick it off every year. They bring all the ranchers into the heart of downtown Denver. It starts right in front of Union Station, and they bring hundreds of head of cattle, longhorns, just march through the streets of downtown. They shut down traffic, and you see all the cowboys riding around, and it's pretty cool. Up until 5 minutes ago, Denver was just a cow town, so it's just cool to connect with our roots, and it draws a big crowd every year. I went to the rodeo this week.
Sounds fun.
Saw some bull riders and some barrel racers. And
did you do any bull riding? Do they let you just go through the? What's the thing where they play poker in the?
Oh yeah, cowboy poker.
Yeah. Cowboy, did you do that?
Yeah, I don't think you could pay me to do that.
Yeah. You have health insurance, right? Through
I do.
Institute.
I don't know if it's good enough for the injuries that would result from that.
Yeah, it seems pretty crazy. But yeah, you also went to an Abs game, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I saw the Abs play. Abs won, so it's a good week all in all. I got to see some bull riding. Got to see my hockey team win. Pretty good week.
Yeah, we had a good week as Flyers fans because now this is going to sound bad at first, right? Cutter Gauthier, who just was one of the stars in the World Junior Championship with the U.S., won gold. We traded him away to the Anaheim Ducks. It's not even a real hockey team. Like they're named after a Disney movie from the 90s. But we traded him away. We got a good return. You know, we got Drysdale, who's this big defensive prospect, but apparently it was because he didn't want to play for the Flyers, and no one really knows why. They still haven't. He's said his people have said personal reasons and just haven't explained it at all. He's wouldn't talk to Flyers organization, and this all sounds like bad news, right? But it's actually good news because now Philly has a new villain forever in this stupid kid. Soft kid, soft as a pillow, could not play in Philly. And so now he's going to go to the great hockey town of Anaheim, California and spend his career there, I guess. But yeah, so it got the whole city a little bit more interested in the Flyers, who have not been great. But the thing is, like, the Flyers are on the upswing. They're having a pretty good season compared to what they were expected to do. And they have a world-class coach in John Tortorella, who obviously is very prickly and not everybody wants to play for him necessarily, but has also won the Stanley Cup and is very well respected around the league. And so they're on the upswing, and they have a big prospect. I think one of the top prospects of this generation coming over from Russia. Now that's also a sort of a risky thing because he's in Russia right now, which is, not ideal, I think, when you're looking at prospects, but he's supposed to be great. So there's a core bit of talent on the team, and then there's supposed to be these big prospects. And so I don't know why he just refused to play, but it pissed everybody off, especially including me. I was going to say
the way he handled it was like tailor-made to fire up the city of Philadelphia, which I would just loved watching from the sideline as a disinterested party. I thought it was great because it was just made to fire up the Philadelphia fan base.
Because he said when they drafted him, he's like, "Oh, I'm built to be a Flyer," blah blah blah. Like he initially was super excited about coming to Philly. At least that's what he was saying to everyone. And then suddenly, just he didn't show up for like camp this year. And that was a little weird, I think, to people. And then, the world champion, the front office actually handled it great because they managed to get a really good return for him. Drysdale Cutter was a number 5 pick. Also, his name's not Cutter. There's another thing. His name is William. That's what people are going to chant at him when he comes to Philly. I can tell you that much. He wants to be called Cutter, but his name is William. So anyway, he's he just stopped talking to the organization, but they managed to get like a number. I think Drysdale was the number 6 pick in his draft, and they got a second round. What's probably going to be a very high second round pick because the Ducks are going to be terrible this year. Most likely, they already are very bad. So we'll probably get a really high second round pick. So not a bad for somebody who was never going to play with you. At least that's what he seemed to insist on. They got a decent return. In fact, Drysdale came in, got a big standing ovation just for being the guy that got traded for the guy everybody hates now. And he scored a point in his first game. So
there you go.
Nice. But yeah, so, we got a new villain, which, Philly sports, that's about as important as having like a new hero.
You guys love a villain.
It's very uniting, I think, especially at a time where Philly sports are not, you got the Eagles falling apart. Hopefully they can pull it together somehow and win this wild card game against the Bucks, who are the team that made it into the playoffs because somebody had to make it in from the NFC South. Right. But at this point with the skid, who the heck knows if the Eagles can beat them. So it's nice to have like a collective thing to be upset about as a Philly fan. I can tell you that much. And then on a happier note, I actually finally got my concealed carry permit in DC. And I say finally, right? Yeah, because it was a long saga, right? Mainly because of their stupid policies on how you apply for the permit, right? Because you have to go in person and you have to make an appointment, and all the appointments are 3 months out from when you first look at the schedule. And there's no apparent reason for this, because when I actually went to apply, you just sit in it's like a DMV style government facility, and you're just sitting there until they call your name and you hand in the documents. And then they took my picture, and they would have fingerprinted me if they hadn't already done that the last time I applied for a carry permit back under the May issue system, and was denied because which I knew I was going to be denied because of the way the system worked. Because I didn't have a good reason. That was back in the good reason clause days. But anyway, there's no real reason. It wasn't like I had a scheduled appointment. I just showed up and waited until they called my name, and I handed in. Literally no reason to do that in person at all. But I had to reschedule that twice because of, one time was that escaped murderer that happened the day I was supposed to go drop off my application. And anyway, so the application part, just turning in the application, was what took so long. The actual processing time was pretty fast, to be honest. I think it was less than a month, if I'm remembering it correctly here, which is actually faster than the processing time was in Virginia. So once they actually get your application in, they move through it pretty fast. So kudos to the people processing the applications, but the system is clearly designed just to be as annoying and infuriating as possible, and to delay the whole process out. There's almost no reason that you couldn't be able to walk in and out, or honestly not even have to go down there and just apply online. Like a lot of other jurisdictions do that, but DC system, it took me 9 months, I guess, to get it, because I had to reschedule twice the appointment to drop off the application. And that's all I did there, was drop it off. So anyway, I have it now. I still have to come up with, I don't know if I'm not quite sure what I want to do yet with the actual carrying aspect of this, because I registered so you have to register the gun that you're going to carry, even if you don't live in DC, right? I live in Virginia. So right now I can only carry that gun that's registered. And also they don't even give you a card. They email you a PDF of your license and your registration, which you're supposed to keep on you at all times. So you have to print it out.
Walk around with a sheet of paper, and
well, I guess you keep it on your phone, as long as your phone doesn't die.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a little weird in that sense. They've abandoned all the paper part of the actual license, but they still make you go in for an appointment to drop off in paper your application. I don't know. It's very strange. But yeah, so you can only carry the gun that you have registered. I have my X Macro registered, which has a 17-round magazine, but DC has a magazine ban where I could carry 2 10-round magazines, but I can't carry 1 17-round magazine, right? Like that's the brilliance of these regulations. But so I'll either have to find a 10-round magazine for my X Macro or some sort of solution like that, or I'll have to register a different gun to get maybe just a regular 365 with a 10-round or a shield or something like that. I don't know. I haven't fully decided yet. I feel like I want to keep carrying the same gun that I would carry in Virginia. So that's the X Macro. But then I'll have to get some DC magazines. I don't know if maybe I'll have to pin them or something, get them pinned, which is a huge waste of money because Sig mags are not cheap.
I was just about to say, I'm sure SIG makes like a state compliant magazine for it, but then it's like you're paying all that money for a SIG magazine.
I actually kind of wonder if they do. They might, now that California is finally opening up their roster to newer guns, but I don't know if the X Macro is on the California roster yet. That's going to be, I guess, my first thing to figure out and to look into and figure out how to buy a 10-round. Because it's funny because it goes against the purpose of the X Macro altogether. The
Right.
whole idea of it is that's why I bought it, so I could have 17 rounds in my carry gun magazine, and something that's still more compact than basically every other gun that holds that many rounds. But so now I'm putting in a magazine, like I'm defeating the whole purpose of having a gun like that. But I don't like, okay, but then do I want to switch to a gun that I'm going to have to switch guns when I go into DC, or, it's a whole annoying thing. It's better. Yeah, I got legal protection if I go into DC with my gun, but it's still a whole pain in the ass. I don't know. We'll see how it works out. But yeah, I think that's all we got for this week. I'll keep you guys updated on the whole DC carry ordeal, because again, of course, they've got a million gun-free zones, and they kind of started this trend of trying to make everything gun-free zones. They have roving gun-free zones that follow around anyone under diplomatic protection has a gun-free zone that follows them wherever they go, and so. I think they were the first ones to do the protest gun-free zone too. So if there's something that is permitted or ought to be permitted, so you're supposed to I guess you have to know what the permitting laws for public demonstrations are, so you can look and try to determine, is that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? These people should have a permit. I need to run away from them, I guess. It's that kind of silliness. I do think you get they can only arrest you after they give you a warning to leave the area, I believe. So there's some practical aspect to it, but it's just kind of comical to think through some of this stuff.
Get your ninja skills ready so you can dash at a moment's notice when you're carrying downtown.
Plus, you can't carry on the metro, so I can only carry if I drive into the city, which driving in the city these days in DC.
Yeah,
and their carjacking rate is through the roof, and so is their murder rate. So, yeah, just not go in there very often if I don't have to. But I can technically carry now, so that's good. I'll have to figure out the details another time. But yeah, that's all we've got. If you like our reporting, if you like this show, please share it with anyone you think might be interested. Leave us a rating on whatever app you're listening to this on. Give us a thumbs up on YouTube. Leave us some comments, give us some feedback. We listen. That's why we're doing this personal update sort of segment at the very end of the show, so people can get the news that they want and decide if they want to keep listening through this or not. That was a direct response to people's comments and suggestions. So we do listen. But yeah, if you like what we do and you want to read more, head over to reload.com, sign up for our free newsletter. You'll get one email a week. We don't flood your inbox. We keep it simple. We keep you up to date with the most important things going on with guns in the country. And of course, if you want more than that, if you want to dive in deeper, you can buy a membership. You'll get access to our member exclusive pieces. We have hundreds of them. They're mostly analysis. Sometimes we get extra bits from stories that are for members only. Of course, you get this podcast a day early, and you get the opportunity to appear on the show as well in a member segment, which we'll have to do another one of those soon. We did one a couple weeks ago, but I always enjoy doing them. You also get to participate in our Q&As, which we'll have to do another one of those soon too, maybe a beginning of the year Q&A sort of situation. Look for that. If you're a member, we'll send out an email when the next time we're going to do one of those to get your questions. But yeah, that's all we've got for this week. We will see you guys again real soon.